idea that there's something taken out of context or something defamatory, I've seen, Mike Lee and some other people posting stuff like that. It's laughable. Quoting you accurately is not defamation. Not printing every single word that you spoke to a reporter is not defamation, is not taking you out of context. But again, judge for yourself. I would encourage your audience to go read the article and ask yourself, is there any context? Is there any new information that would change the meaning of these quotes? And not just from Susie Wiles, but the ones from the rest of the people that were interviewed as well, who said a lot of interesting things on the record as well.
I mean, yeah, it was just every sentence had a new interesting tidbit. And I think especially for Susie Wiles, I mean, this isn't her first rodeo, right?
No.
You would know saying these things, that would be the story, right? So I am curious. This is what she did say, though. And part of my language, I'm quoting her. This isn't me.
You heard them speaking right there. And you know what gets me absolutely floored in this moment is the pure unfiltered audacity of watching someone systematically dismantle the entire MAGA propaganda apparatus piece by devastating piece, because Wiles called Vice President Vance a conspiracy theorist, and here we are watching the fallout of what happens when reality collides with the fever dream that is Trump world and Mike Lee, and the whole coterie of right-wing enablers screaming about defamation, as if quoting someone accurately is somehow an act of war against their perfectly constructed house of lies. This is the story they don't want you to understand because it exposes the rot at the very core of this administration. And I'm telling you right now, this is going to get bigger and messier and more explosive as we peel back each layer of what Vanity Fair published based on a series of 11 interviews over the course of a year with Wiles, and the sheer magnitude of what she revealed should shake every single person who cares about democracy to their absolute foundation. Let me paint the picture for you, because this isn't just some petty palace intrigue, although believe me, there's plenty of that to feast upon. But this is about the fundamental architecture of authoritarian power and how it operates in plain sight, while gaslighting an entire nation into thinking that journalism itself is the enemy. Senator Mike Lee accused Vanity Fair of defaming Wiles, and here's where the intellectual dishonesty reaches truly staggering proportions, because Lee used the language of wrongdoing, calling a thoroughly sourced profile defamation, without identifying a single factual error. And this is the playbook, folks. This is how fascism creeps into the discourse, by redefining the very nature of truth itself, until reporting becomes persecution, and accountability becomes assault. The guest in that clip absolutely eviscerated this nonsense by pointing out what should be blindingly obvious to anyone with even a shred of critical thinking capacity, which is that quoting you accurately is not defamation, and not printing every single word you spoke to a reporter is not taking you out of context. And yet here we have an entire ecosystem of right-wing politicians and media figures throwing an absolute tantrum because their own chief of staff sat down and told the truth about what's happening inside the White House. And what did she tell them? Oh, this is where it gets absolutely delicious, because Wiles said that Trump has an alcoholic's personality, despite the fact that Trump doesn't drink, and she detailed her expertise on this subject, given her own father's struggles, and this isn't some random insult, this is a clinical observation about a man whose personality operates on the extremes, whose impulses are exaggerated, whose need for control and validation and dominance mirrors the psychological architecture of addiction itself. She said, when there's an opportunity for Trump to take retribution, he will go for it, which completely obliterates the carefully managed narrative that this administration is somehow restrained or measured or operating within normal democratic boundaries, because guess what? It's not, and we've known it's not, and now we have confirmation from the person closest to the seat of power that the revenge tour is real and ongoing, and absolutely central to how this White House functions. But wait, because it gets even more explosive, and this is where the January 6th pardons come roaring back into focus with all the moral bankruptcy that defines this entire movement, because Wiles revealed there had been huge disagreements over implementing tariffs, and said she had to get on board with Trump's decision to give blanket pardons to Jan and let that sink in for just one moment, because the chief of staff herself, the person supposedly managing the chaos, the person supposedly providing guardrails, admitted that she opposed pardoning the most violent rioters, but Trump did it anyway, and she fell in line. The interviewer noted that JD Vance previously said before the pardons that if you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned, but then Vance was reportedly 100% behind Trump's decision to grant clemency to all rioters, and when confronted about this stunning reversal, Vance blamed the Justice Department for unjustly prosecuting well over 1,000 Americans in a way that was politically motivated, which is such breathtaking gaslighting that it deserves its own category in the Propaganda Hall of Fame, because these were people who had been convicted of or pleaded guilty to assault of or obstructing law enforcement officers and 170 of using a deadly weapon. And we're supposed to believe that prosecuting people who beat cops with flagpoles and brass knuckles is somehow political persecution. This is the through line that connects every single scandal, every single controversy, every single moment of this administration's descent into authoritarianism, which is the systematic destruction of objective reality itself, and the insistence that any accountability, any scrutiny, any attempt to document what is actually happening constitutes an attack that must be repelled with maximum force. Republican leaders used the Susie Wiles backlash to argue for disengaging from independent media, and independent reporting is treated as illegitimate unless it serves power, and this should terrify every single person who understands that democracies die in darkness, but they also die in broad daylight when the people in power convince enough citizens that the truth is whatever they say it is, and everything else is a hit piece. And speaking of hit pieces, let's talk about how Wiles called the Vanity Fair article a disingenuously framed hit piece, and said significant context was disregarded, and much of what I and others said about the team and the president was left out of the story, and claimed this was done to paint an overwhelmingly chaotic and negative narrative about the president and our team, which is the standard playbook response when you've been caught saying things you didn't want the public to hear. Except here's the kicker, here's the part that exposes the entire charade, which is that Wiles' statement did not deny that she was accurately quoted, and neither did any of the other officials who came rushing to her defense in this choreographed display of loyalty, because the central talking point became that the profile lacked context, and supporters blasted the outlet for being unfair, rather than offering any direct refutation of the authenticity of quotes, or what was reported. So in other words, everything she said was true, they just don't like that she said it. Or more accurately, they don't like that you now know what she said. The reporter Chris Whipple, who conducted these interviews, is a serious journalist who has written extensively about White House chiefs of staff, and he described having 11 in-depth, on-the-record interviews over the past year, with an extraordinary level of access to Susie Wiles. Whipple told NPR that Wiles' response stood out precisely because it avoided disputing the substance of the reporting, which tells you everything you need to know about whether this is legitimate journalism or a fabricated smear. Because if the quotes were inaccurate, if the context was truly distorted in a way that changed their meaning, then the response would be to provide the actual quotes to release transcripts to demonstrate precisely how they were misrepresented. But that's not what happened, because it can't happen, because she said what she said, and now she's dealing with the consequences of having participated in a long-form, deeply reported profile that actually did its job. And what else did she reveal in this extraordinary series of interviews? She talked about Elon Musk and said he's an avowed ketamine user, and he sleeps in a sleeping bag in the EOB Executive Office building in the daytime. And he's an odd duck, which is just a surreal detail about one of the most powerful unelected figures in the administration, someone who has been gutting the federal government through his so-called Department of Government Efficiency, and we're supposed to just accept that this ketamine-using billionaire who sleeps in a sleeping bag during the day has unprecedented access to presidential power and policy decisions. She criticized Attorney General Pam Bondi, saying Bondi completely whiffed on her handling of the Epstein files, and she called Budget Director Russell Vought a right-wing absolute zealot. And these aren't off-the-cuff remarks made in a moment of frustration. These are considered assessments offered over multiple conversations, spanning nearly an entire year, which suggests that Wiles genuinely believed she was participating in a historical record, a behind-the-scenes account of how power actually operates in this White House. But here's where it gets even more insidious, because one former Trump administration official said they were surprised the White House participated in the interviews, saying, "I'm not sure what they were thinking here." And there's speculation that some think it's 50-50 that Wiles is able to keep her job if reaction to the profile becomes too intense, which exposes another layer of the authoritarian playbook, which is that loyalty is only valued when it produces favorable outcomes, and the moment you become a liability, even if you've been faithful, even if you've subordinated your own judgment to serve the leader's whims, you become expendable. Trump himself said he hadn't read the Vanity Fair article, and that Wiles has done a fantastic job, and he has full confidence in her, and the facts were wrong, and it was a very misguided interviewer, purposely misguided, which is Trump's standard response to any journalism he finds inconvenient. Blame the messenger claim, you haven't read it or seen it, but somehow know it's wrong, and then move on while your supporters attack the journalists and the outlets and the very concept of independent reporting. The really fascinating and deeply disturbing element here is watching how Trump's top aides, cabinet officials, and some of his staunchest online protectors came to Wiles' defense in the hours after the story sent Washington abuzz, in this coordinated display of solidarity that papers over the fact that she literally sat there and criticized multiple members of the administration on the record for publication. Dozens of prominent Republicans, including 10 current Trump cabinet secretaries, FBI Director Kash Patel and Donald Trump Jr., took up Wiles' defense with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, calling her the single most effective operator whom I have ever met, and saying no one is more insightful, effective, and loyal, which is such transparent damage control that it would be comical if the stakes weren't so apocalyptically high, because what they're really saying is please don't fire her, please don't purge another person from the administration, please let us maintain some semblance of stability, even though we all know this is chaos incarnate. And let's return to the defamation claim for a moment, because this is where the legal and political dimensions intersect in ways that should alarm anyone who values press freedom, or the First Amendment, or the basic ability of journalists to report on powerful people without being threatened with lawsuits. The guest in that clip said something so important that I want to make sure it lands with the full weight it deserves, which is that quoting you accurately is not defamation, and not printing every single word that you spoke to a reporter is not defamation, is not taking you out of context, and she encourages the audience to go read the article and ask yourself, is there any context, is there any new information that would change the meaning of these quotes? This is the fundamental test of journalistic integrity, and it's a test that the Vanity Fair piece clearly passes, because if there were exculpatory context, if there were qualifying statements that completely changed the meaning of what Wiles said, then we would have seen those statements, we would have seen the receipts, we would have seen the administration releasing full transcripts or recordings to prove their case, but instead what we got was a vague claim about missing context, coupled with extravagant praise for the president and his team, which tells you that there is no there. Journalism is recast as injury rather than inquiry, and this linguistic sleight of hand is how authoritarians operate. They redefine criticism as attack. They redefine accountability as persecution. They redefine transparency as betrayal. And before you know it, the entire apparatus of democratic governance has been hollowed out and replaced with a cult of personality that cannot tolerate dissent. This language serves a purpose when reporting is defined as ideological warfare or personal harm. Avoiding reporters becomes prudent rather than evasive, and accountability is reframed as exposure to danger. And this is how press freedom erodes in practice, not through dramatic crackdowns necessarily, although we're seeing elements of that as well, but through this slow, steady delegitimization of the very concept of independent journalism, until the only acceptable media outlets are those that function as state propaganda machines. The January 6th pardons deserve their own extended analysis, because they represent perhaps the most shocking exercise of presidential power in this entire sordid affair, and the hypocrisy is so dense, so layered, so multidimensional, that you could teach an entire semester course on it. Trump extended clemency to those convicted of violent and serious crimes, including assaulting police officers and seditious conspiracy, and he also ordered the Attorney General to dismiss all pending indictments related to the Capitol riot, essentially eradicating the Biden Justice Department's massive effort to hold accountable those who participated in the assault. And remember, this is the same party that spent years positioning itself as the party of law and order, the party that backs the blue, the party that demands respect for police and authority. And yet when their own supporters, when their own movement, when their own insurrectionists attack police officers with weapons and send them to the hospital with concussions and trauma, Trump pardons them, and Vance defends it, and the entire apparatus closes ranks. Daniel Rodriguez used an electroshock weapon against a policeman by plunging it into the officer's neck, and he was sentenced to 12 years 7 months, and he got a pardon. And Ronald Maccabee hit a cop while wearing reinforced brass knuckle gloves, and he held one down on the ground as other rioters assailed the officer for over 20 seconds, causing a concussion. And these are not edge cases. These are not people who wandered into the Capitol and took a selfie. These are violent criminals who engaged in coordinated attacks on law enforcement, and they have been absolved. They have been granted full, complete, and unconditional pardons, and we're supposed to just accept this as normal, as acceptable, as within the bounds of presidential authority. And yes, technically the pardon power is absolute, but that doesn't make its exercise legitimate or moral or consistent with any coherent principle of justice. And the fact that Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said he didn't like the idea of bailing people out of jail or pardoning people who burned down cities and beat up cops, and that while the pardons were within Trump's legal authority, he added, "I fear that you will get more violence," and said pardoning the people who went into the Capitol and beat up a police officer violently, I think was a mistake, because it seems to suggest that's an okay thing to do. tells you that even some of Trump's most servile allies understand that this crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. There's a philosophical dimension to this that connects to broader questions about the nature of political violence and who gets to deploy it, and under what circumstances and for what ends, because the message being sent by these pardons is crystal clear, which is that political violence in service of Trump, in service of maintaining Trump in power, in service of overturning election results that Trump doesn't like, is not only permissible, but will be rewarded. Hannah Arendt wrote extensively about how totalitarian movements operate, about how they create parallel realities, about how they demand absolute loyalty that supersedes law and morality and truth itself. And we are watching this play out in real time with a MAGA movement that has convinced itself that the real victims are not the police officers who were beaten and hospitalized, but rather the people who beat them because they supposedly faced an unfair prosecution process. JD Vance said, "If any of us have learned a lesson from that Vanity Fair article, I hope that the lesson is we should be giving fewer interviews to mainstream media outlets." And there it is, stripped of all pretense, the explicit call to disengage from any media that might actually hold them accountable, to retreat into the safe spaces of right-wing propaganda, where they can say whatever they want without challenge, without fact-checking, without any obligation to reality. This is the information warfare dimension of the broader authoritarian project, where the goal is not to win the argument on the merits, but to create such epistemic chaos, such confusion about what is even knowable or verifiable, that people throw up their hands and retreat into tribal allegiances, because at least those feel certain, at least those feel secure. But we cannot let them get away with this. We cannot allow this framing to take hold, because what happened here is actually quite simple, quite clear, quite undeniable. Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff, the most powerful woman in government, according to some assessments, sat down for extensive on-the-record interviews with a serious journalist, and she told him what life is actually like inside the Trump White House, and what emerged from those conversations is a portrait of chaos, dysfunction, revenge, retribution, and policy-making, driven by the president's whims and grudges, psychological needs rather than by any coherent governing philosophy. She revealed that we have a loose agreement that the score settling will end before the first 90 days are over. But that agreement was obviously meaningless, because when asked about the prosecution of New York Attorney General Letitia James for mortgage fraud, Wiles allowed, well, that might be the one retribution, which is her essentially admitting that yes, this is revenge, yes, this is using the apparatus of federal law enforcement to punish political enemies, and who would blame him? She asks, who would blame him for wanting retribution, which is the ultimate abandonment of any pretense that this administration operates according to the rule of law. The photos accompanying the Vanity Fair piece have generated their own controversy because extreme close-ups of Trump's inner circle, including Caroline Leavitt, Susie Wiles, JD Vance and Marco Rubio, have set the internet alight, and the unvarnished look at some of the most powerful people in the country is an increasingly rare sight, because the photographs feel particularly incongruent to an administration that has long made clear its preference for friendly media, limiting access to the White House and Pentagon for some traditional mainstream outlets. And this gets to something really important about image control and the construction of political mythology, because authoritarian movements require a certain aesthetic. They require their leaders to appear strong and commanding, and larger than life, and any photographic treatment that reveals the humanity or the vulnerability, or frankly just the normal human features of these individuals is treated as an attack because it punctures the myth. Trump has applied pressure over unflattering photographs and paintings, lobbing criticism at a recent Time magazine cover, which showed the sun through his wispy hair. It sets a dangerous precedent for a presidential administration to wield influence over images that offend it, because we are veering into territory where the press is expected to function as a propaganda arm, where journalists are expected to produce hagiography, rather than documentation, where any unflattering detail, any honest depiction is reframed as bias or malice. This is how press freedom dies, not with a bang but with a whimper, with journalists gradually internalizing that if they want access, if they want to keep their sources, if they want to avoid being attacked by the president and his millions of followers, they need to pull their punches. They need to soften the edges, they need to make the powerful look good. And let's be absolutely clear about what's at stake here, because this is not just about one profile in one magazine. This is about whether we will have a functioning independent press capable of documenting and scrutinizing power as Trump heads deeper into what is clearly an authoritarian second term. The interviews with Vanity Fair were themselves uncharacteristic for Wiles, who cut her reputation as someone who brought order to the president's chaotic style and shunned the spotlight so much that at Trump's 2024 election night victory party, She repeatedly shook her head and avoided the microphone as Trump tried to coax her to speak to the crowd, which makes her decision to participate in these extensive interviews all the more remarkable and puzzling and worthy of analysis, because what was she thinking? What was her motivation? Was this an attempt to shape the historical record? Was this a cry for help? Was this hubris? Was this naivete about how the media works? Or was this perhaps a recognition that someone needs to document what's actually happening before it's too late? Trump usually doesn't tolerate bad headlines and negative attention for long, which makes the Vanity Fair article one of the first major tests of his loyalty to his longtime confidante. And this is the permanent state of anxiety that defines life in Trump's orbit, where you are always one bad news cycle away from being cast out, from being humiliated, from being destroyed, because loyalty only flows one direction, and it is always conditional, and it is always dependent on whether you are useful in the moment. The Trump presidency functions like a mafia organization, where omerta is the only real value, where speaking truth, even speaking truth to document history, is treated as the ultimate betrayal, and where the boss's whims supersede everything, including your own survivals, instincts, including your own better judgment, including your own moral compass, such as it is. We need to talk about the sheer Orwellian doublethink required to maintain the position that Trump world is currently taking, which is that yes, Susie Wiles said all these things, but also the article is a hit piece, and yes, everything she said was quoted accurately, but also it lacks context, and yes, she spoke to the reporter 11 times over the course of a year, but also she was somehow taken advantage of, and yes, these are her words, but also you shouldn't trust the media that published them. This is the fabritomological collapse that authoritarianism requires, because in order to maintain power, in order to keep people loyal, in order to prevent them from believing their own eyes and ears, you need to make it impossible to determine what is actually true, and you need to train your supporters to reflexively reject anything that comes from sources you have labeled as enemy media, regardless of the evidence, regardless of the documentation, regardless of whether the subjects themselves acknowledge the accuracy of the reporting. So when the guest in that clip says go read the article and judge for yourself, she is issuing a challenge that the Trump administration desperately does not want you to accept, because if you actually read the article, if you actually look at what Susie Wiles said in context, if you actually examine the pattern of admissions and revelations and behind-the-scenes details, you will come away with an understanding that this White House is exactly as dysfunctional and revenge-driven and untethered from democratic norms as the critics have been saying all along. You will understand that Wiles comes off as far more candid than her public persona, and she not only speaks openly about both President Donald Trump and those who make up the core of his administration, but appears to acknowledge that at times she has been at odds with some of the policies that have been central to Trump's second term, and this admission that the chief of staff herself has been at odds with major policies should alarm everyone, because if even the person managing the White House cannot shape or moderate or provide guardrails for the president's most extreme impulses, then there are no guardrails, then we are truly in the realm of unchecked executive power. The tragedy here, and it is a genuine tragedy for anyone who believes in democratic governance, is that we needed more Susie Wiles moments. We needed more officials willing to speak on the record about what they are witnessing. We needed more
documentation,
more transparency, more sunlight as the best disinfectant, but instead what will happen is exactly what Vance said, which is that fewer people will talk to mainstream media, fewer people will participate in serious long-form journalism, fewer people will risk telling the truth because they have now seen what happens when you do. They have seen that even if you are one of Trump's most loyal operatives, even if you have subordinated your own judgment to his whims, even if you have enabled and facilitated and managed his most destructive impulses, you will still be thrown under the bus. The moment your candor becomes inconvenient, and the whole apparatus will coordinate to destroy your credibility and the outlet that published your words. This is how authoritarianism entrenches itself, through fear, through intimidation, through the systematic elimination of spaces where truth can be spoken and documented and preserved for history. And we are watching it happen in real time, and the question is whether enough people will recognize what is happening before it becomes irreversible. The Vanity Fair controversy is a test case. It is a canary in the coal mine. It is a warning about where we are headed as a country, and as a democracy, or what remains of it. And if we cannot even agree that accurately quoting public officials is legitimate journalism, then we have lost something fundamental. We have crossed a threshold into a place where reality itself becomes a matter of political allegiance rather than empirical fact. And I want to end by returning to Mike Lee's defamation claim, because it encapsulates everything that is broken about this moment. Lee did not simply accuse Vanity Fair of bias, he used the language of wrongdoing, calling a thoroughly sourced profile defamation, without identifying a single factual error, and this weaponization of legal language to intimidate journalists, to threaten outlets, to create a chilling effect where reporters think twice before publishing anything that might anger powerful people, is a direct assault on the First Amendment and on the foundations of democratic accountability. Defamation requires proving that something false was published with knowledge of its falsity, or reckless disregard for the truth, and nothing in the Vanity Fair piece meets that standard. Nothing has been identified as factually false. The complaints are all about framing and context, and the alleged failure to include enough positive information, but that is called editorial judgment, that is called journalism, that is called telling a story, and if every profile had to include equal amounts of praise and criticism, if every investigation had to be balanced with sufficient flattery, then investigative journalism would cease to exist, because you cannot expose wrongdoing while simultaneously making the wrongdoers feel good about themselves. This is the fight of our time. This is the battle between transparency and authoritarianism, between accountability and impunity, between journalism and propaganda, and the Vanity Fair Susie Wiles saga is a flashpoint that reveals the fault lines and the stakes with absolute clarity. So yes, go read the article. Yes, judge for yourself. Yes, look at what she actually said, and ask whether the Trump administration's response is designed to correct the record, or to intimidate anyone else who might consider telling the truth about what they witness in the corridors of power. The answer is obvious, the pattern is clear, and the danger is immense, and we have to be willing to say it. We have to be willing to fight for the right of journalists to do their jobs without being threatened with defamation suits, or losing access, or being labeled enemies of the state, because once that fight is lost, once the press is fully neutralized, once only regime-friendly media remains, then the authoritarian project is complete, and there is no coming back.